No one would give $1 for that sheep. Charles Mercer called across the muddy auction yard, and the laughter that followed seemed loud enough to reach the gray windows of Whitmore Hall itself. Grace Miller did not laugh. She stood near the back fence beneath a cold October sky, her worn brown coat buttoned tightly against the wind, watching the ewe at the center of the ring lower her head, as though even the animal understood she had become a joke. The annual Whitmore livestock auction had drawn farmers and wool merchants from more than 50 miles away, men who knew the weight of a fleece by sight and could argue over pennies until sunset, yet not one of them had raised a hand when the auctioneer asked for an opening bid. The ewe was small, older than the others, with mud dried along her legs and a coat so tangled that no buyer seemed willing to imagine what might lie beneath it. $5, the auctioneer tried. Silence. 3. Someone chuckled. Charles Mercer, broad beneath his expensive black coat, folded his arms and said, "You would have to pay me to feed her through winter." More laughter moved through the crowd. Grace felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rise beneath her collar, though none of the words had been directed at her. She knew too well what it meant to stand in a place where others had already decided your worth. At 24, she lived in a 2-room cottage at the northern edge of the Whitmore estate, surviving on seasonal work, mending, and whatever she could earn tending animals for neighboring tenants. Her father had once been among the finest shepherds in the county. Now his name was rarely spoken. Duke Ethan Whitmore stood beneath the covered platform beside the auction clerk, tall and motionless in a charcoal coat, his expression giving away nothing. He had watched dozens of animals sell that morning without comment. His estate owned thousands. One unwanted ewe should have meant nothing to him. Then his gaze shifted beyond the ring and settled on Grace. She had not noticed him watching. Her attention remained fixed on the sheep. There was no pity in her face, only concentration. When the auctioneer finally lowered his hammer without a sale, 2 farmhands moved forward to lead the ewe away. Grace stepped closer before she seemed to realize she had done so. Charles noticed. "Perhaps Miss Miller wants her," he said lightly. Several men turned. "She has about the same prospects." The laughter this time was quieter, but sharper. Grace lifted her chin. Ethan's eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "Then give the sheep to Miss Miller," he said. The yard fell still. Grace looked toward him. For one long second, neither moved. She could have refused. Pride urged her to. Instead, she crossed the muddy ring while every eye followed her, accepted the rope from the farmhand, and said, "Thank you, Your Grace." No trembling, no apology, no gratitude beyond what courtesy required. Charles smiled as though the Duke had merely found an elegant way to dispose of useless stock. Grace turned to leave, but the ewe shifted beside her, exposing a narrow patch beneath the dirty outer fleece. Something caught Grace's eye. She stopped. Slowly, she pushed 2 fingers through the tangled wool and parted it near the shoulder. Beneath the coarse surface lay a layer of fiber so fine and pale it seemed almost silver in the weak afternoon light. Grace's breath caught. She touched it again, more carefully this time. Then she saw the faint dark marking near the base of the ear, a mark she had not seen since childhood, a mark drawn again and again in the old notebook her father had kept locked in a wooden chest. The laughter behind her faded from her awareness. 30 years ago, Whitmore's rarest bloodline had supposedly vanished. Grace stared at the ewe no buyer would bid on and realized that perhaps everyone in that yard had just made a mistake. Grace did not speak again until the auction yard had disappeared behind the hedgerows and the wind had carried away the last trace of laughter. The ewe followed slowly at her side, the rope loose in Grace's gloved hand, her narrow hooves sinking into the damp road with each uncertain step. By the time they reached the northern cottage, dusk had settled across the Whitmore fields in a wash of silver and blue. Grace pushed open the warped wooden gate and led the animal into the small shed beside the house, where clean straw, a bucket of water, and the faint warmth of stored hay offered more comfort than the auction ring had shown her. Only then did she kneel. "Let us see what they missed," she whispered. The ewe watched her with tired brown eyes while Grace carefully separated the dirty outer fleece. The first layer was exactly what every buyer had seen: coarse, matted, neglected. Beneath it, however, the fibers changed. They became softer, finer. Grace drew several strands between her fingers and felt a memory rise so clearly that for a moment she was 12 years old again, standing beside her father in the old shearing barn, while Samuel Miller held a lock of wool beneath the morning light. "Never judge a fleece from the surface, Gracie," he had told her. "Weather lies, mud lies, neglect lies. The fiber underneath tells the truth." Grace closed her eyes. Her father had been dead for 4 years, but his voice remained in certain places, in the smell of lanolin, in the scrape of shears against a wooden table, in the soft rustle of sheep moving through tall grass. She returned to the cottage and pulled a small wooden chest from beneath her bed. Inside lay Samuel's notebook, its leather cover cracked, its pages crowded with numbers, sketches, breeding records, and observations written in his steady hand. Near the middle, Grace found the drawing she remembered. A narrow face, a dark mark beside the left ear, a distinctive line of wool along the shoulder. Below it were the words, "Whitmore silver, old maternal line, nearly gone." Grace looked toward the window. The ewe stood beneath the shed lantern, chewing quietly. Her heart began to beat faster. Years earlier, Samuel had insisted that the estate was losing its best wool by breeding only for size and quantity. He had argued with the former livestock manager, warned that the old line should be preserved, and refused to change his records when ordered. Soon afterward, he had lost his position. Most people in the village decided pride had ruined him. Grace had watched him carry that disgrace without bitterness, even as money grew scarce and neighbors stopped asking for his advice. One day, he had told her, someone will look closely enough. Grace turned another page. There, written beside a date nearly 30 years old, was a notation about the final registered ewe from the silver line being transferred to a northern flock before records became incomplete. No proof, no certainty, only a trail that had vanished into silence. Grace returned to the shed with the notebook pressed against her chest. She examined the ear marking again, then compared the shape of the ewe's head, the texture near the shoulder, the unusual pale undercoat. Each detail matched enough to make hope dangerous. She did not know whether the animal was truly descended from Samuel's lost bloodline. She knew only that her father had believed something valuable had been discarded because powerful men had stopped paying attention. Across the estate, lamps were beginning to glow in the windows of Whitmore Hall. Somewhere beyond those distant lights lived the man whose family name appeared on every page of her father's ruined career. Grace rested one hand against the ewe's neck. "If he was right," she murmured, "we will prove it properly." Outside, the first cold rain of the night began tapping against the roof, and inside the little shed, something long dismissed as worthless quietly became a question no one at Whitmore could ignore forever. 3 mornings later, Grace woke to the sound of carriage wheels grinding over the wet road outside her cottage. She had been awake before dawn, measuring feed and checking the ewe. She had begun calling Mabel when the dark carriage stopped beside the gate. A moment later, Duke Ethan Whitmore stepped down into the pale morning mist. He wore no ceremonial coat, no polished expression meant for crowded rooms, only a dark wool overcoat dampened at the shoulders and the same unreadable gaze Grace remembered from the auction yard. Behind him stood Mr. Harris, the estate steward, holding a ledger beneath one arm. Grace knew before either man spoke why they had come. "Miss Miller," Ethan said, "there appears to be a problem." Grace set the feed bucket beside the shed door. "With the sheep?" Mr. Harris opened the ledger quickly. "The animal was marked for removal from estate stock, Your Grace, but ownership was never formally transferred. The auction record lists no sale." Grace looked at Ethan. "You gave her to me." "I did," he said, "in front of half the county." "Then why are you here?" There was no accusation in her voice, only quiet caution. Ethan seemed to notice that more than anger would have unsettled him. "Because my steward believes estate property cannot simply disappear from the books." Grace glanced toward Mabel, who stood beneath the shelter calmly pulling hay from the rack. "Then put her back in the books." Mr. Harris cleared his throat. "It is not quite that simple." Grace disappeared into the cottage without another word. Ethan expected perhaps a document, perhaps the notebook he had seen tucked beneath her arm at the auction. Instead, she returned carrying a small cloth purse. She opened it and counted several coins into her palm. "This is what I have," she said. "Sell her to me properly." Ethan looked at the coins. The amount was painfully small, less than he might spend on a single dinner in town. Yet the way she held them made refusal feel strangely dishonorable. You intend to spend your savings on an animal no one wanted? I intend to own what was given to me. That is not the same thing. It is to me. The wind moved through the bare branches above them. Ethan studied her face, searching for desperation and finding none. Then his gaze shifted past her shoulder toward the shed. Mabel looked noticeably stronger than she had at auction. Her coat was cleaner, her posture steadier. You have been feeding her differently. She was not useless, Grace replied. She was neglected. Ethan's attention returned to her. You sound very certain. Grace hesitated only once. My father taught me to be certain only after looking closely. At the mention of Samuel Miller, something changed in Ethan's expression. The name was not unfamiliar. It belonged to an old dispute buried somewhere in estate records. One Ethan had signed years earlier without giving it more than a few minutes of thought. You believe this sheep has unusual value. I believe she deserves enough time for me to find out. Mr. Harris shifted impatiently, but Ethan raised one hand. Keep your money. Grace's fingers closed around the coins. Her chin lifted. I do not accept charity. It is not charity. Ethan stepped closer to the fence, his voice quieter now. Keep the ewe until spring shearing. If you can prove she carries the value you suspect, she becomes yours without further question. If you cannot, the estate takes her back. Grace watched him carefully. And who decides what counts as proof? You may present it to me yourself. Not Mr. Harris? To me. The answer hung between them. Grace looked toward Mabel, then toward the distant roofs of Whitmore Hall barely visible beyond the fields. Very well. Ethan nodded, but as he turned back toward the carriage, his eyes fell upon the corner of Samuel Miller's old notebook resting on the cottage windowsill. For the first time that morning, Grace saw real curiosity disturb the Duke's composure. He looked at the notebook, then at her. Your father kept records? Grace placed herself quietly between Ethan and the window. He kept the truth. Ethan said nothing for several seconds. Then he stepped into the carriage, leaving Grace with the ewe, the bargain, and the uncomfortable certainty that by spring she would not only have to prove what Mabel was worth. She might also have to prove that her father had been right all along. Winter settled over Whitmore with the quiet severity of a judgment. Frost silvered the fences each morning. The fields hardened beneath a pale sky, and smoke rose thinly from the chimneys of tenant cottages scattered across the estate. Grace measured the passing weeks by Mabel's appetite, the thickness returning to her frame, and the slow improvement of the strange pale fleece hidden beneath the coarse outer wool. She worked without ceremony. Warm mash before sunrise, clean bedding before dusk, careful examination of the ewe's feet and teeth. Notes copied into the margins of Samuel Miller's old book until Grace's own handwriting began to mingle with her father's. Then, one night in January, Mabel stopped eating. Grace noticed it before the ewe had finished turning away from the feed bucket. By midnight, the animal stood weakly beneath the shed lantern, breathing shallowly, while freezing rain rattled against the roof. Grace wrapped herself in an old wool cloak and remained beside her, warming water, checking her condition, refusing to surrender to exhaustion. She had just carried another bucket from the cottage when a horse approached through the darkness. Ethan Whitmore appeared beyond the gate, his shoulders wet with rain, one gloved hand holding the reins. Grace stared at him. Your Grace. I saw the light from the south road. He glanced toward the shed. Is something wrong? Mabel is ill. Ethan tied the horse beneath the bare apple tree and stepped inside before Grace could decide whether she wanted his help. The little shed suddenly seemed smaller with him there. He removed his gloves, rolled back the cuffs of his coat, and crouched beside the ewe without hesitation. Tell me what to do. Grace looked at him sharply. You know nothing about sheep? Apparently less than I thought. Despite herself, she almost smiled. Hold her steady. He did. For the next hour, title and poverty ceased to matter. Ethan held the lantern when Grace needed both hands. He carried water from the cottage. He followed every instruction without argument. The storm pressed cold fingers against the wooden walls while the lantern flame trembled between them. At last, Mabel drank. Grace released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Ethan noticed. You expected the worst. I have learned not to expect mercy from Winter. His expression changed, though she could not name why. They sat on opposite sides of the narrow stall, while Mabel rested between them. For several minutes, only rain and the soft movement of straw filled the silence. Ethan's gaze fell upon Samuel's notebook near Grace's knee. Your father believed this line should have been preserved. He believed many things the estate did not want to hear. You mean the livestock manager? Grace looked up. I mean Whitmore. The word landed harder than accusation. Ethan studied the lantern flame. I was 26 when your father was dismissed. My father had been dead less than a year. I signed whatever my senior managers placed before me because I believed experience made them trustworthy. Grace's face became still. You signed it. He met her eyes. Yes. The warmth of the shed seemed to vanish. For years, Grace had imagined the decision as something distant, faceless, almost mechanical. Now the hand that had signed it was less than 4 feet away. The same hand that had carried water for Mabel through the storm. He came home that day without his shepherd's staff, Grace said quietly. I had never seen him leave the estate without it before. Ethan said nothing. He told me there had been a disagreement. He never blamed you. That seemed to trouble Ethan more than anger would have. Perhaps he should have. Grace closed the notebook. Perhaps you should have asked what you were signing. Ethan lowered his gaze. There was no defense in him now. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills, distant and low. Mabel shifted, then settled again. Ethan rose slowly. At the door, he paused. I cannot change what happened to your father. Grace remained beside the you. No. But if there is truth in those records, I will hear it. She looked at him across the wavering lantern light. Hearing it and accepting it are different things, Your Grace. Ethan stood motionless for a moment before stepping into the rain. Grace watched the darkness swallow him, and for the first time since their bargain began, proving Mabel's worth no longer felt like the hardest thing she would have to do. By the first week of March, the snow had retreated from the lower fields, leaving the earth dark, wet, and shining beneath a weak spring sun. Mabel had recovered enough to graze again, and Grace spent every spare hour comparing her father's notes with the old markings she had found beneath the used fleece. One afternoon, while searching through a stack of discarded breeding ledgers in the small estate records room beside the shearing barn, she found what Samuel Miller had spent years trying to prove. The entries were nearly 20 years old, written in fading ink and crossed through more than once. But the pattern was unmistakable. Several ewes from the old silver line had been recorded as poor producers and sold for unusually low prices. Beside each sale appeared the same buyer's name, Charles Mercer. Grace read the page twice, then a third time. Her pulse quickened as she followed the records forward. The animals had not vanished because the bloodline had failed. They had been quietly removed from Whitmore stock and purchased for a fraction of their true value. Samuel had written warnings in the margins. Fine undercoat preserved. Do not classify by weight alone. Review Mercer purchases. Grace closed her eyes. Her father had been right. More than right. He had seen the pattern before anyone else and lost his position for refusing to ignore it. She gathered the ledgers against her chest and crossed the courtyard toward Whitmore Hall, determined to place them directly in Ethan's hands. The great house stood gray against the evening sky, its tall windows reflecting the last light. Grace entered through the service corridor and had nearly reached the study when she heard voices beyond the half-open door. Charles Mercer was inside. There is no reason to reopen old accounts, he was saying. Samuel Miller was difficult, proud, and determined to see fraud where there was only ordinary trade. Grace stopped. Ethan's voice followed, low and controlled. And the sheep? An accident of breeding. Nothing more. Miss Miller believes otherwise. Charles gave a short laugh. Miss Miller wants her father's memory restored. Grief can make patterns where none exist. Silence. Grace waited for Ethan to answer. Instead, Charles continued. You signed the dismissal yourself. If this becomes public, people may ask why the Duke of Whitmore allowed his own shepherd to be removed for questioning estate practices. Grace's fingers tightened around the ledgers. Then Ethan spoke. I am aware of what I signed. The words were calm. Too calm. Charles lowered his voice. Then you understand why some matters are better left buried. Grace did not wait to hear more. She turned away, the ledgers suddenly heavy in her arms. She had believed the stormy night in Mabel's shed had changed something between them. She had believed Ethan's promise to hear the truth meant he was willing to face it. Now she felt foolish for confusing regret with courage. By dawn the next morning, Grace had packed Samuel's notebook, several dresses, and enough food for the road. She left Mabel in the care of an elderly neighboring shepherd and walked toward the village before anyone at Whitmore Hall knew she had gone. Hours later, Ethan entered the records room and found the old ledgers open across the table. Samuel's handwriting stared up at him from the margins. He read every line. Then he noticed a folded page tucked inside the final volume, written in Samuel's hand years after his dismissal. Ethan unfolded it slowly. The message was brief. The young Duke does not yet know what is being done under his name. One day he may. Ethan stood very still. Samuel had not accused him of corruption. He had believed him ignorant. That realization cut deeper than blame. Ethan reached for the bell and summoned Mr. Harris. "Find Miss Miller." The steward hesitated. "Your Grace, she left the estate before sunrise." Ethan looked once more at Samuel's words, then toward the distant northern road visible through the window. For the first time in years, the Duke of Whitmore understood that silence could become a form of guilt, and Grace Miller had just walked away believing he had chosen it. Grace returned to Whitmore 3 weeks later because Mabel was ready for shearing, and because some promises mattered even after trust had fractured. The morning was cold but bright, with sunlight pouring through the high windows of the shearing barn and turning dust into gold above the wooden floor. Men moved between pens, sorting fleeces by weight and quality while clerks recorded every bale. Grace entered quietly through the side door, carrying Samuel Miller's notebook beneath one arm. Conversation softened when people noticed her. Charles Mercer stood near the sorting tables in a dark coat, speaking with 2 buyers from the county. His smile vanished for only a second. Ethan Whitmore was farther across the barn. He saw Grace at once. He did not approach her. That restraint surprised her more than an apology would have. Mabel was brought forward near noon. Several workers exchanged doubtful looks when they recognized the ewe from the autumn auction. Charles gave a faint laugh. "We are still wasting time on that one." Grace ignored him. She knelt beside Mabel and ran one hand gently along the animal's shoulder. The shearing began. Coarse outer wool fell away first, dull and uneven, exactly as everyone expected. Then the blades moved lower. A pale layer emerged beneath it. Softer, cleaner, unusually dense. The room grew quieter. Grace lifted a small lock between her fingers and separated the fibers carefully. They caught the sunlight like fine silver thread. One of the older wool sorters stepped closer. "That is not ordinary estate fleece." Charles moved toward the table. "Let me see it." Grace placed the wool out of his reach. "You may look." His expression tightened. "I can offer you a fair price now, Miss Miller. More than this animal would bring anywhere else." "No." The answer came so quickly that several workers looked up. Charles stared at her. "You have not heard the offer." "I do not need to." Ethan stepped closer at last. "What do you intend to do with it?" Grace turned to him. For the first time since leaving the estate, she met his gaze directly. "Sell it where the buyer does not know my father, my position, or your name." Ethan understood immediately. "London." "Yes. I can have Whitmore agents arrange the sale." "No." That refusal was quieter, but it carried farther. Grace rested one hand on the fleece. "If this wool has value, I want to know what it is worth without your title standing beside it." Something passed through Ethan's face, not offense, but recognition. "Then it will go under your name." Charles scoffed. "A young woman walking into the London wool trade alone will be fortunate to receive half what I am offering." Grace looked at him. "Then I will learn that honestly." The old sorter cleared his throat. "There is a textile house on Franklin Street that purchases specialty fleece by sample. I could prepare a proper grading certificate." Grace nodded. "Thank you." Ethan said nothing until the workers began wrapping the fleece in clean cloth. Then he approached the table and placed a sealed envelope beside her notebook. Grace did not touch it. "Money?" she asked. "No. The address of a broker who owes Whitmore no favors. He will not know who sent you unless you tell him." Grace studied him carefully. "Why help me?" Ethan's voice lowered. "Because the first time your father asked this estate to look closely, I failed to do so." She looked down at the envelope. "That does not erase anything." "I know." Grace finally picked it up. Across the barn, Charles watched them with a stillness that made the air feel colder. 2 days later, the finest portion of Mabel's fleece left Whitmore in a plain wooden case labeled only with Grace Miller's name. No ducal seal, no estate crest, no explanation. And as the wagon disappeared along the southern road, Grace realized that for the first time, whatever happened next would belong entirely to her. For 11 days, nothing came from London. Grace tried to convince herself that silence meant only delay, yet every morning she found herself listening for wheels on the road outside the cottage. Mabel grazed peacefully in the new spring grass, unaware that a portion of her fleece had traveled farther than Grace ever had. At Whitmore Hall, preparations began for the estate's annual merchants' dinner, when buyers from several counties gathered to negotiate contracts for the coming season. Grace had no intention of attending until a note arrived from Ethan. It contained only one sentence: "Your presence may be necessary." She nearly refused. Then, on the afternoon of the dinner, another envelope came, this one bearing a London postmark and addressed to Miss Grace Miller. She carried it unopened to Whitmore Hall. The dining room glowed beneath chandeliers and tall candles, its long table crowded with merchants, landowners, and estate managers. Charles Mercer sat near Ethan, speaking confidently about market prices as servants poured coffee. Grace remained near the doorway in her plain blue dress, feeling every glance that turned toward her. Charles noticed first. "Miss Miller," he said with a smile that carried no warmth. "Have you come to sell us another miracle?" A few men laughed politely. Grace said nothing. Ethan rose from his chair. "She is here at my request." The room quieted. Charles leaned back. "Then perhaps we should discuss business. I have offered Whitmore $22 per pound for the finest selected wool this season. A generous figure in the current market." Ethan's expression remained unreadable. "You call it generous. I call it realistic." Before Ethan could answer, the doors opened and Mr. Harris entered with a stranger wearing a dark traveling coat. The man carried a leather case and introduced himself as Henry Caldwell, purchasing representative for Harrington and Lowe, a specialty textile house in London. His eyes moved across the room. "I am looking for Miss Grace Miller." The silence changed. Grace stepped forward. "I am Grace Miller." Mr. Caldwell smiled and removed a folded document from his case. "Then I owe you an apology for arriving without notice. We received your sample 10 days ago. Our graders tested it twice because the first result seemed unusually high." Charles gave a dismissive sound. "High in what sense?" Caldwell glanced at him. "Fiber fineness, elasticity, uniformity, and softness. We have not handled a domestic fleece of this character in several years." Grace's fingers tightened around the unopened letter. "What are you offering?" Caldwell turned fully toward her. $46 per pound for the prepared fleece, with a further contract if you can produce wool of comparable quality next season. No one spoke. Grace heard the ticking of the clock above the fireplace. $22. 46. More than twice the price Charles had just praised as generous for Whitmore's best wool. Charles stood abruptly. One fleece proves nothing. A fortunate animal, perhaps. An unusual season. Caldwell remained calm. "We are not purchasing fortune, Mr. Mercer. We are purchasing quality." Ethan did not look at Charles. He looked only at Grace. She unfolded the letter at last and saw the same number printed beneath her own name. For years, men with estates, titles, ledgers, and polished offices had decided what Samuel Miller knew was worth. Now a stranger who knew nothing of her father, nothing of Whitmore, and nothing of the laughter in that muddy auction yard had reached the same conclusion Grace had reached with 2 fingers beneath a dirty fleece. Charles tried to recover his composure. "If Miss Miller wishes to sell through my company, I could negotiate future terms." Grace met his eyes. "No, thank you." 3 quiet words ended the matter. Caldwell began explaining the proposed contract, but Grace barely heard him. Across the table, Ethan slowly rose. There was pride in his face, but something heavier beneath it. Respect, certainly. Perhaps shame. He lifted his glass, not toward the merchants, but toward Grace. "It appears," he said, "that Whitmore has spent many years mistaking quantity for value." This time, no one laughed. The morning after the merchants' dinner, Ethan Whitmore ordered every livestock ledger from the previous 20 years brought into the estate library. By noon, the long oak table was buried beneath account books, purchase records, breeding charts, and faded correspondence. Grace stood near the window with Samuel Miller's notebook in her hands while Ethan compared her father's notes against Whitmore's official records line by line. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. Animals marked as poor producers had been sold cheaply through Charles Mercer. Their descendants later appeared in private sales at prices far above what Whitmore had received. Payments that should have returned to tenant breeders had disappeared inside vague accounting entries. Ethan's face grew colder with every page. Charles arrived before sunset, summoned by a message that revealed nothing. He entered confidently, but his confidence weakened when he saw the ledgers spread across the table. "Your Grace," he began. "Surely this misunderstanding can be handled privately." Ethan closed one account book. "That is how it survived this long." Charles glanced toward Grace. "You are trusting the judgment of a shepherd's daughter over men who have managed this trade for decades." Ethan's eyes did not leave him. "I am trusting records." The silence that followed was absolute. By the end of the week, Charles Mercer's contracts with Whitmore were canceled. More importantly, Ethan ordered a full review of every affected sale and repayment to the tenant families who had been underpaid. He did not call it generosity. He called it restitution. Grace noticed the distinction. 3 days later, Ethan gathered shepherds, tenant farmers, wool workers, and estate managers inside the shearing barn. Grace arrived expecting another business announcement. Instead, she found Samuel's notebook resting on a small table beside Ethan. Sunlight entered through the high windows, touching the worn leather cover her father had carried for years. Ethan faced the room without notes. Samuel Miller warned this estate that valuable bloodlines were being discarded and that our purchasing system was being abused. Several older workers lowered their eyes. He was dismissed after refusing to withdraw those concerns. Grace's breath tightened. Ethan continued. "He was right. No one moved. And I signed the order that removed him." A murmur passed through the barn, but Ethan did not look away. "I was young, inexperienced, and willing to believe that authority could substitute for attention. Those facts explain my failure. They do not excuse it." Grace felt something inside her shift. She had imagined this moment many times, but never like this. She had expected victory to feel sharp. Instead, it felt quiet, almost solemn. Ethan turned toward her. "Miss Miller, your father saw what Whitmore failed to see. So did you." Grace held his gaze. "He wanted the work corrected more than he wanted an apology." "Then help me correct it." A few people exchanged surprised looks. Ethan stepped away from the table, leaving the distance between them open rather than crossing it. "I can restore money. I can change contracts. I can dismiss dishonest men. What I cannot do is rebuild a breeding program I do not understand well enough." Grace looked toward Samuel's notebook. "You have experts. I had experts when your father was ignored." His voice softened. "I am asking for judgment, not obedience." That distinction reached her more deeply than any offer of wealth could have. "And if I disagree with you?" Grace asked. "Then I will listen before I sign anything." A faint warmth touched her expression. Ethan saw it and seemed almost startled by how much it mattered to him. Grace walked to the table and placed one hand on Samuel's notebook. "The silver line cannot be restored from Mabel alone. We will need to trace related flocks, compare fleece quality, and stop breeding only for weight." Ethan nodded. "Show me." She looked at the Duke who had once given her an unwanted animal without understanding what he was placing in her hands. Now he stood before his own workers asking her to teach him how to see what power had made invisible. Grace opened the notebook. "Then we begin with the first page." 2 years later, spring returned to Whitmore beneath a sky washed clean by rain, and the fields that had once produced ordinary wool now carried small flocks descended from lines Samuel Miller had nearly watched disappear. Grace stood beside the lower pasture fence with a ledger tucked beneath one arm, while young shepherds moved carefully among the ewes, recording fleece quality, weight, and lineage according to the system she had rebuilt from her father's notes. Whitmore wool had earned a reputation far beyond the county, but Grace cared less for the praise than for what had changed closer to home. Tenant families now sold through a cooperative that posted prices openly. Shepherds were paid for quality, not merely volume. No manager could remove breeding stock without written review. Ethan had kept every promise he made in the shearing barn, though Grace had made certain he earned each one slowly. Mabel, now gray around the muzzle and entirely uninterested in commerce, spent her days in a quiet pasture near Grace's cottage. One warm afternoon, Ethan found Grace there sitting beneath an old elm while Mabel grazed several yards away. He carried no papers. That alone made Grace suspicious. "You are avoiding the estate office," she said. "For 10 minutes. A serious decline in discipline." Ethan smiled, a rare expression that had become less rare around her. He sat on the opposite end of the bench. For a while, they watched Mabel crop the grass beneath the afternoon sun. She produced nothing this season, Ethan said. I noticed. And yet you still keep her. Grace looked toward the ewe. Of course. Why? She turned to him. Because usefulness is not the price of being allowed to stay. Ethan became very still. Grace had not meant the words as a lesson, but she saw them reach some older place in him, the part that had once measured land, animals, contracts, and perhaps even people by what they could produce. Your father would have approved of that answer, he said. My father would have said it with twice as many words. Ethan laughed softly. Then he reached into his coat and drew out a small velvet box. Grace stared at it, then at him. That looks dangerously formal. It is. Should I be worried? Probably. He opened the box. Inside rested a simple ring, elegant but restrained, with no unnecessary display. Ethan did not kneel. He remained beside her, close enough that she could see uncertainty beneath the composure that had once seemed impossible to disturb. Grace, I have spent 2 years learning that asking correctly matters more than commanding confidently. Her expression softened. That sounds expensive. It has cost me a considerable amount of pride. Then perhaps it was worth the investment. He looked down at the ring, then back at her. What does a duke have to be worth before a woman like you would consider bidding on him? Grace held his gaze for a long moment. The old version of Ethan Whitmore would have expected an answer. This man waited for one. At last, she said, more than he was when we met. His mouth curved. I feared that. Grace extended her hand. Fortunately, Your Grace, you have improved. The relief in his eyes was quieter than joy and somehow deeper. He slipped the ring onto her finger as Mabel lifted her head from the grass, regarded them for one indifferent second, then returned to eating. Grace laughed. Ethan joined her. Beyond the pasture, Whitmore Hall stood above fields transformed not by wealth alone, but by the decision to look again at what had been dismissed too quickly. Samuel Miller's notebook remained in the estate library, preserved beside the new breeding records, its worn pages no longer evidence of a forgotten man's stubbornness, but the foundation of everything that followed. And Grace never forgot the simplest truth her father had taught her. Some things are called worthless only because the wrong people were asked to name their price.